normally when I talk about what we're doing at the state, I start off with a discussion of the changes of the industry and why we need to move to a cleaner, more distributed energy system. I think given today's audience and your interest, I'm going to dispense with the prologue of all the drivers that are driving change in the industry and rather talk about what we're doing rather than why we're doing it, and so we can spend more time on that. Just to begin with, you know, we all sort of are a little bit of a product of where we came from, and I wanted to, you know, as I reflect on what we're doing and how, when I started, I had an opportunity to join the Cuomo administration and conversations I had early on with Richard Kaufman and John Rhodes, we all sort of saw things the same way, although we had very different backgrounds. Certainly Richard more from the financial background and good energies, and John the same thing, and from and consulting, and mine really from the industry. And my industry experience, as John has said, I've sort of gone full circle. I started out as a regulator. I'm a regulator now. But when I was at Excel, one of my jobs was Excel had a number of mandates that it had to do to put in renewable energy early on. This would be in the early 90s as a result of a nuclear power plant that they owned where they had to put dry cask storage. They ran out of storage. And the deal they cut with the legislature was they could keep the nuclear plant running so long as they installed 100 megawatts of wind and 25 megawatts of biomass. And this was in 1990, so this was quite some time ago from where the industry is today and where Excel is today. But what's interesting to me is that while, you know, one of my assignments was to make that work, there was a huge amount of resistance among the executives. I mean, they never really believed it would work because, after all, Excel had 60% coal, 20%, 30% nuclear, and the rest gas and oil. So they were not believers. They just had a mandate, and they were going to fulfill their mandate because that was their obligation. And along the way, it did work. But still, there was a huge amount of resistance, and so understanding and seeing the need to get that cultural change firsthand was sort of informative to me. But what's more informative is that coming from the utility industry, and I don't mean this negatively at all, is that 95% of Excel's earnings at that point came out of retail regulation. And so from their perspective, meeting the needs of whatever the retail regulation required them to do was their obligation to their shareholders because that's how they basically made money. They had to meet the mandates, the obligations, and things like that. And so as a result, they fulfilled all their mandates, but they really weren't incented to do anything more because doing anything more would just cost their shareholders money, and there was nothing in it for their shareholders. And so sort of one of my lessons learned is that regulation, and actually one of my former predecessors, Peter Bradford from the Commission, said this, is all regulation is as a form of incentive regulation. The job of the regulator is to figure out what behavior you want to incent, because utilities have an obligation to their shareholders just as well as they have an obligation to their customers. And so what you set up as an objective and an outcome is really what utilities have an obligation to fulfill. And so you have to be careful of what you ask, because what you ask is what you get. And so that was sort of lesson number one. Lesson number two, going from PJM. PJM was one of the early markets. We moved to locational marginal pricing. And what we found is that when you have a centralized dispatch and you have an entity that's really focused on how you manage the system in terms of reliability and economics, and using incentives as opposed to penalties, you drove a lot more efficiencies out of the bulk power grid. So one of the things that we saw in PJM, like we've seen in all of the wholesale markets, is that moving to price-based formulas as well as an incentive base, where as opposed to just cost of service, you do realize better economies of scale. And for example, the generators across all the markets increase their capacity factors hugely during the lifetime of the markets. And when you have a single entity that's managing diverse resources in a way to drive efficiency, because PJM's obligation was to run a reliable market in the most efficient manner it could using competitive markets, is that we drove efficiency in the bulk power grid. And that realized in real benefits to customers. What I also recognized, as though at PJM, is that we did have an incentive to try to move to the demand side And we had programs around demand response. And they were very valuable. My data is a little dated, but I've seen other information that's sort of a similar magnitude. In 2005 and 2006, when we had really high gas prices after the hurricanes in New Orleans, we ended up being able to demonstrate that by having demand response participate in the wholesale markets, we were able to save $650 million for consumers in 3 days. So in other words, managing demand can be one of the most effective ways you can to manage price. But unfortunately, the bulk power system is really managing it just at the peak days. What it can be done is it can be managed every day, but it's really hard for the bulk power markets to do that. Lastly, my last experience with Aridity, and I'll eventually get to how this drives all to rev, is that we worked on load management. We had a software system where we were trying to basically integrate distributed resources, whether it be storage, solar, building management systems, to be able to participate in the wholesale energy market. So by using predictive information about load consumption and price, our hope is to basically drive customers so that they weren't just looking at reducing peak demand, but they're actually looking at energy efficiency all of the time. The difficulty I realized with that business model is that to get the customers incentive, we really needed to have utilities embrace system efficiency as sort of one of their goals, because it's a very difficult model to do for an individual customer to just simply about managing demand unless they really saw a way to monetize it, and the wholesale markets probably were not the easiest way to get there. The other thing that I discovered is that if you do this right, you have a huge amount of capital that you're using intelligently. My best example from a Aridity example is that we were working with SEPTA, which is the subway system in Philadelphia. And like all subway systems, it was electrified, and they essentially they used electricity to run the trains. What happens, though, is because the trains use regenerative braking, when the trains brake, they produce energy, and when they accelerate, they consume energy. But because they used more energy, produced more energy when they were braking, they threw a lot of it away. So we had a program where we actually captured the excess energy in a battery and then used that energy on the trains. And what that did is two things. It reduced SEPTA's operating expenses, but it also produced a value to the grid in the form of frequency regulation, which they could then monetize. So the aha moment of all of this is that when you have the ability to use distributed energy resources, whether they're solar, whether it's load control, whether it's CHP, both to help the needs of the consumer behind the meter and also to help the grid, you sort of are doing a triple win, because from a consumer's perspective, their need for those distributed resources can be for reliability, security, for environmental protection, environmental goals. But if they use it for their own needs, and it's also used to support the grid, and the grid can then also use it to manage demand, it helps the individual consumer reduce their operating costs. It helps the grid operator because now they can use these distributed energy resources rather than investing in the system. And by the by, it helps all consumers because when the distribution utility can manage demand and make it more efficient, then that reduces the need to rely on central station generation plant, which then reduces prices in the market. So the point is that we always think about historically demand response as sort of that last element, the ability to reduce load voluntarily, that we take off the grid to reduce price. But really, if you think about this as the first thing we do, system efficiency, then it's not only going to make better use of all the capital that customers are putting in anyway, but it's going to make the grid more efficient, and it's going to reduce the price for everyone, which is really the whole point of becoming more productive, is really using your resources better. So that's sort of all rounded up to in the policies that really the Commission is pursuing today. So we, over the last, since actually October last year, we've announced certain changes that we're making. And really part of this is that it's summed up in our EAPS order in December. We wanted clean energy to stop being what would be considered a peripheral element of how we run and operate and plan the grid. Rather, we wanted to get from programs that are administered to really a central portion of what the system is all about. And so our objectives across the year is really about how do we go from this being programmatically designed to integral to the design and operation of the system, so it's sustainable not just from a market perspective, a regulatory perspective, and everywhere else. So it was a big goal we set up for ourselves, but I think it's an essential goal. To do that, we identified in our EAPS order several different policy objectives that we thought were going to be very important for us to move forward. One is to really move to a customer-centric mentality. And that, you can say that in a lot of different ways, and people have said it forever, customer empowerment, and we want to be customer-centric. But the point is that if you think about the system, no longer from the standpoint of when you think about, historically, when we think about the utility system, we start with generators, transmission, distribution, and down there at the right-hand corner is the customer, a little building, is really think about it as the customer on the way out. If you were to rebuild the grid, and you would think about it from meeting customer needs first, is really thinking about how you move consumers from a perspective where they're bill payers or rate payers to really that they have control, not only of what they buy in terms of they're interested in clean energy and things like that, but even how much they consume, their ability to use distributed resources, load control, energy efficiencies, things like that, as a way of thinking about it as around what we call bill management. It's really about not thinking about, well, we have to drive down commodity costs, we have to drive down distribution costs. What we really need to do is drive down the customer bill in the best way possible, and because that's what the customer thinks about, and that's really what essentially they're buying, because they don't really buy electricity. They buy using their refrigerator, using their computers, using their lights, and what they'd like to do is manage the bill to get there. And a lot of them are also, and I think this is the other thing we're learning, all customers are not the same. And some customers really want to buy clean energy, and some customers want to have a larger amount of control. But it's starting to think about it in a very customer-centric way. The other piece is animating markets. So one of the things that, and I'm sure John Rhodes might have mentioned it this morning, is really leveraging the consumer dollars, really saying that we can't just do these things in terms of public money funding programs. We really need to think about how do you animate the markets to get the private dollars in, and so that the market players become part of the sustainability index that we're trying to do around these programs. And I missed a piece. One of the things that we learned in PJM that is really critical is that markets have go up and down, and people's acceptance of different programs go up and down. The way to create stickiness is to create markets, because you have multiple players in the arena. The ability to have that sort of stroke of the pen risk where a new administrator comes in town and says they want to do something differently goes down a lot when you have markets that actually are working. So getting to that point where you're animating markets or multiple players who've invested in the markets is very important. The third piece is system efficiency. And we talk about a lot about individual energy efficiency, which is reduction of kWh of an individual. What we're talking about is system efficiency. So for example, in New York, like a lot of systems, we have very few hours a year where the system will go up from a normal of 25,000 to 35,000 peak. And that's, it's less than 100 hours a year. And the whole point of that is that during those top peak hours, New Yorkers could be spending on total of about $450 million a year more for energy just to keep the system available during those really peaky periods, because of the fact that you have to have the system there just to manage those peaks. So we can just make the system more efficient. We have an average load factor of somewhere between 50 to 65%, meaning that there's a lot of capability on the system that's being underutilized, and we can run that up so we can have better load factors through using distributed resources. That will reduce the need of potentially building new distribution, new transmission, new generation, because we'll be managing it better. So this isn't necessarily about reducing consumption. It's making consumption much more efficient, because actually the more electrified you have of an economy, usually the stronger the economy is. So that's sort of a big piece of what we're looking at, is generating system efficiency. The other piece is, of course, resiliency and reliability. In the post-Sandy world, we realize how critical that is. And that means, again, for us, when we look at it from a regulator, we have to have a huge amount of capital that we need to put in the system. We already have aging infrastructure in New York. We looked at a calculation of business as usual that where the last 10 years we've invested in total across the state about $17 million in infrastructure, 17 billion. We're looking at another 30 billion over the next 10 years. And if you talk to the utilities, their sales are not growing, even though their peak is growing. So it means you're going to have to put all this investment on a potentially smaller base, which will hence raise rates. And so while affordability is important for us, it's really important for us to think about how do we make sure that we keep the system resilient and do it in the most efficient way. So in other words, it's capital as utilization, making the system that much more productive while you're creating resiliency. And a big piece of that is around using distributed resources much better. And then lastly is the issue of emission reduction. That is sort of a permeated goal through all of this, is using clean technology in a much better way, again, so it's integral to the system. So we have 6 different proceedings. I counted them. It's no wonder why my staff grimaces when they see me. But we started off at the end of last year looking at how to change energy efficiency. We realized that we were micromanaging a lot of programs that we didn't need to. And there's a lot of parts of the system that were broken that needed to be fixed. But that's really where we sort of announced we're going forward with these other elements. We also started the Green Bank, which is, and I would say I would break this as to 2 things we're looking at, is how to get more financing in, and then changing the regulatory formula. So we have Green Bank, New York Sun, the Clean Energy Fund are really all focused on better financing mechanisms. And I won't spend much time on that. I'm sure you've heard about it. And then the other 2 pieces is really then changing the regulatory world. Because something I realized, as I mentioned, coming out of the utility framework myself, is that what we've done in New York, and we are fortunate here because, one, we have utilities that are embracing change. They want to do things better and different. Secondly, we're a single state ISO, which actually makes it's easier for us to create change. But the other thing is that because New York has restructured, all our distribution utilities are distribution and transmission and gas companies. They don't own generation. So their ability to think about what a utility of the future looks like and can be is much easier than in other states where you have utilities that own generation and are largely generation companies that happen to own distribution systems. And so we're very fortunate in New York in that we actually have, I think, the best framework to move all of this forward. And really what we're looking at is we're saying that in New York, we, over the last 10, 15 years when we restructured the industry, done a lot of things like we've decoupled utility earnings from kilowatt hours consumed. We've moved to forward-looking test years. We've had multiple 2-3-year test rate cases, which you keep rates stabilized for a period of time. All those things are things that other states are actually starting to look at and say, well, we need to move in this direction. But one of the things we didn't do very well is we made the utilities somewhat neutral in the sense that they're not economically harmed, but we didn't really align the incentive of creating a cleaner, distributed resource with the positive outcomes a utility could use in terms of earnings by using these resources better. So we really need to think about, well, we can't really get the utilities too excited if all we do is keep them neutral. We need to think about how do we align incentives. And again, coming out of the markets, one of the things I've learned is that you get a lot more about getting the incentives right than thinking about getting the penalties right. So it was really about, thinking about re-regulating on that idea. So what we've done, we're doing in the REV docket, and we call it Reforming the Energy Vision, is really thinking about taking all these various elements and putting them in the place of what do we need to do to change the regulation of the distribution utilities, change how we manage the retail markets, to align with our goals of creating a more customer-centric, cleaner, efficient system that uses clean energy as its core. So a couple things we're doing. The first is we said that really you need to change the idea and the concept of a distribution utility. Traditionally, you think of a distribution utility as the company that manages the wires and the substations and delivers energy, when in today, going into the future, is that as we move towards more distributed behind-the-meter generation, as we think about more smart systems where you have real-time control and real-time sensors, is that utility really is not just the wires company, but they become really the platform to integrate these resources so that they can be used and to their best of capability to manage both the reliability of the system, but also help create a much more efficient system from a load profile basis. So we actually are saying that, you know, you have to think about it not just having a wires company, a distribution utility, but also the platform, which involves a lot of communications and integration of systems that we really haven't seen before. So we said basically we have to transform the model and think about what is this future model where you really are more of an integrator than necessarily just stopping at the meter, because you really want to make use of these resources in the best possible way. And so part of this is saying, well, then what does that model entail? One is the traditional planning function. You know, utilities always think about, you know, where's low, and we broke this up into two tracks. One is, we call it track 1, track 2, very innovative. In track 1, we're thinking about what's the model itself. What does a utility need to do going forward? One, in terms of planning, is utilities today will plan, they'll identify, here's what our demand is on our system today, here's where the load pockets are growing, this is where we're going to invest. Well, one of the challenges is how do you make that transparent? So if people want to put in solar, and they want to put in CHP, they want to put in storage, they can identify where the opportunities are on the system, so it's much easier for them to identify where they can provide value to the system versus where they're going to hurt the system. So it's making the system that much more transparent. Again, you have to realize I come from a bulk power system where that kind of planning is, transparent planning is sort of bread and butter. So that's one piece. The other piece is how do you operate the system, and that's really going to be using these resources, not just to reduce peak, but actually to help maintain the reliability of the system. Also potentially managing demand in all hours, not just in the certain hours, again, to create a much more efficient system, which means it's a huge communications network that we probably don't have today, and we have to think about how we build that out. But again, if we can use these behind-the-meter resources much better, then it's going to drive down prices for everyone. Well, part and parcel of that is going to be, well, then what's the utility relationship? And that's a big issue, and it's got a lot of people clutching their stomachs, but between the distributed energy resources and the utility. Because it's one thing if these buildings here have a CHP plant that they use to reduce their consumption, but Con Ed is not really relying on it to keep the system stable. Con Ed needs to know what's going on, but it's not dependent on it. But if you start thinking about this, we're putting in these behind-the-meter resources as an alternative to putting in wires and substations. Con Ed or National Grid or Central Hudson or Rochester are going to depend on those resources. So they need to understand that the resources are going to be there, and that relationship then between the utility and those resources fundamentally changes, because now they're part and parcel, and hopefully they're being compensated for being available. So in my little terminology, they become part of the rate base, essentially, even if the utility doesn't own it, but they become part of the resources that the utility is now using to meet its obligation to serve reliably. So it really changes the nature of the utilities relationship now with these resources. So we have to, that's a big part of this, to sort out what does that mean and how do we incent that relationship and what's the right compensation schemes. The other thing we're talking about is consumer engagement. So one of the things that's a big thing that I realize, when you're talking about the wholesale market, and we restructured the industry, and utilities sold off generation, and power marketers got created, and things like that, everybody was in the game. I mean, they were all there to make money, and really it was all about how they were going to make money, not whether they wanted to be part of the game, because this was their business. Big piece for us moving forward as we think about animating markets is getting consumers engaged. So another element, a big piece of our case, is going to be incenting consumer engagement. And when I say that, I really mean the mass market. The large end users are engaged. When people spend $1 million, $2 million a year on energy, don't worry, they've invested, they know what programs are available, and they're absolutely engaged. But what about the mass market? How do we make it easier so that we create a pull rather than a push? So when you think about it, when I'm talking about consumer engagement, is that, you know, Apple or Samsung don't have to worry about whether people want smartphones. People want smartphones, and they are excited about every release, and they hang out at the stores. But how do we, in energy efficiency, we're still struggling to get consumers engaged around solar and things like that. So how do you create the pull? How do you create the excitement? What's the trick to really get through this tipping point so this becomes a very easy thing to sell? So a big piece of what we're talking about is how do we move in that direction? Again, that's not going to be an over in the night, but realizing that getting them engaged, figuring those sources out is going to be critical. The third piece that we're doing, also talking about in track one, is the products and services. So when we talk about a distribution utility integrating it, what does that mean in terms of products and services that utility might offer? In other words, how the utility will compensate distributed resources, what kind of information needs they have, what kind of data can we make available, and how easy, and making it available easily so that we can actually animate these markets. So all of those types of major policy issues that are really being dealt with in what we call this track one phase, which is really defining this solution and defining what it is when we say this distribution utility is of the future. The next piece is track two, which is really then focused on what I call the regulatory and the transactional framework. And the regulatory frame, it's really thinking in terms of moving from where we are today, where we have a system of penalties but not a whole lot of incentives, and really thinking in terms of the outcomes you want to achieve. So if, for example, we want to achieve innovation, how do we give a utility incentive to drive more innovation in their system so that economically they're better off when they have more players on their system? If we're trying to drive system efficiency, so we're going from a 60 to 50 or whatever % load factor to 65 or 70, so if today a utility earns a 9% rate of return at where they are, can they earn a 10% rate of return if they drive a more efficient system? Because after all, if the system becomes more efficient, prices go down, and shouldn't their shareholders be rewarded? Certainly Wall Street rewards companies that are more efficient. Why shouldn't regulators? So it's really thinking about that alignment. If emission reduction is a goal, how do we get the utilities actually economically incentive for reducing emission reduction? What are the metrics we're going to use? So that's a big piece. And then the other is moving away from 1 or 2 year rate cases to 3 to 5 year rate plans, because we're really talking about investment. And we want to make sure that there can be investment plans, and we're looking at these and monitoring them. So it's more performance-based regulation. And then also thinking in terms of not only the outcomes, but also how do we get away from where we are today, which is really utilities only make a return on the capital they own, to really where the utilities can be somewhat indifferent, whether it's CapEx or OpEx, as long as they're achieving the outcomes we want to achieve. Now, there are other states, places that are looking at this. Certainly in England, they've sort of moved in this direction, and Ontario's moved in this direction. So we're not alone, I would say, but taking a look at this and trying to really think in terms of the next few steps to get us there and move in this direction so that our distribution utilities really become the platforms of innovation and are driving change, so they become the pull, is really what we're driving to, what we want to achieve. The last piece in doing this is also then thinking about the rate structure, where today everything we do is largely end users pay for everything, is really thinking about it, and basically I call it 3 boxes, and we'll probably start with 1 and 2, and 3 may take some time to develop. But 1 would be the fact is defining basic utility service, so what everyone pays for, what we socialize, really the network that we're trying to run. Then the second is really the compensatory scheme, because now we're saying these distributed energy resources are of value to the grid, and they may be valuable for reducing peak, they may be valuable for operational, they may be valuable because they provide reactive power. So we have to think about those monetization schemes that then compensate the distributed resources for the value they're providing to the grid or for load response and things like that. So when you think about it then, what we're talking about is just like in telephone, we talk about plain old telephone service. It's what is basic electric service. And then when you're thinking about how to drive consumer value, incenting consumers, because now you can monetize the ability to control and manage your load, manage your usage, as a schematic to both reduce your bill and then to think about these resources as really part and parcel of running an efficient system, so that it provides an economic value back to consumers. And then lastly would be what I would say the to-be-developed services, is really innovative services around the information and data that now can be used, that maybe the utilities will develop or third parties can develop, that can be then sold really to help people run their businesses. And I'll use an example, and because it's the only one that I've actually two I can think to. One is, for example, differentiated services. We heard from a lot of industrial customers they need higher power quality. If a utility wants to offer higher power quality services and a third party can do the same thing, in other words, we'll put in behind meter resources or we'll put in different types of electronics, would we allow utility just say charge a fee for that? I mean, why, and use that to offset your basic revenue requirements, a portion of it, and keep some of it for your shareholders? Because it helps the customer, it helps everybody else, and why shouldn't we incent you to get into that business? Or, for example, National Grid in Massachusetts, Tom King used this example in a meeting we were with, and I exhausted it, but it's the best one I could think of, is that they offer a service that if there's a storm coming up and you happen to have an electric garage door opener for a New York City audience, that means you have a garage and you open it yourself, is that you can go out before the storm. They'll notify you and say, storm's coming, you might want to disconnect your garage because you may be out. And I said, that's great. But my thinking is, why not charge for that? If someone's willing to pay you $5 a month to have additional information, and then you could take $3 of that and plow it back into offsetting your revenue requirements and $2 for your shareholders, why wouldn't I want a utility to think about different services they could offer that are not really basic, but are adjacent and might be valuable to customers and might help avoid some of the revenue increases because people will start differentiating what kind of things they might want. So that's, to me, a third bucket. And we saw with the telephone companies, for those of you who can remember, you know, we never knew what call waiting, call forwarding was. Initially, it was something you bought. It was like, you know, the cup holders in your car. It was an add-on, and then it becomes basic. So I could see us going in the same direction. We find add-on services, and then suddenly they become basic services. But that's sort of the third area that, you know, to be developed, but I think is an opportunity. Goal is, though, ultimately is this, is I think we are well positioned in New York. We definitely have the need to do things differently. We have an opportunity because of the way we restructured the system historically to move forward quickly. And we have an absolute capability, I think, with the technology to get us where we want to go. We had a little chat with some of the folks I was talking about, you know, some of the standards, for example, around inverters. It's not a question of whether smart inverters are available. It's really regulation that's getting in the way. So our point is that we need to get regulation out of the way. We think the technology is there, and as long as we incent the utilities and make this core, we'll get there, and we'll be able to get there quickly. Now, how much time do I have? I have a few minutes. So what I would ask, actually, of this group, there's a lot of different collaboratives that are going on. We have a lot of different teams working. It's very important for us to hear from not just the utilities. You know, part of this change is the ecosystem's changing. It's not just utilities, regulators, and a few people in the market. It really, we need to hear from almost everyone in terms of what's going to make your business grow. You know, if we set the incentives, again, the right way, then I think, you know, this to me is opening up a huge market and gives folks great opportunity to really expand this business. Our goal, in this, at least for my goal in this energy team, is that in 3 to 5 years, the energy experience in New York is so fundamentally different than what it's been in the last 5 years that customers get it. They say, wow, we like the direction we're headed. We don't want to get off this path, so keep going. So our goal as a team, and I would call this not just the agency, but the utilities and the various constituents, is help us identify what are those 3 or 4 things that we really need to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years so that we are not at risk of someone coming along and saying that was a bad idea just as we're sort of birthing this. But it really makes it a fundamental imprint on customers that this is really a benefit to them, which gets back to getting them engaged, seeing how they can make their electricity more affordable, and giving them the choice that they really want. So I look forward to your participation. We do have an aggressive agenda. We're trying to make key policy decisions by the end of the year. I want the utilities in a position next year to start filing plans that integrate these types of concepts. I'm really, quite gratified, even though there have been a few people who have sort of huffed and puffed and said you're going too fast. But for the most part, I think people realize that we need to get on with it, and there's no use in waiting anymore. So thank you.